and somewhat obsessive about classification. Corvinsil was considered eccentric even by Caldren standards, because he preferred solo missions in deep space to the warm communal research stations most of his colleagues favored. He liked the quiet. He liked the dark. He liked the way that being very alone in very large space had a way of clarifying things. He was deep in his third cataloging run, surrounded by data streams and stellar maps and a cup of something warm that passed for coffee among the Caldren. It was made from fermented mineral water and tasted like rust, but he developed a fondness for it, when his sensors picked up something that made no sense. He set the cup down. He leaned forward. He ran the scan again. And again. He started then stopped. He pulled up the reading. His instruments were showing a mass, a large, solid, artificial mass, moving at a speed and trajectory that should have been impossible. Not because of any physical law, but because of its vector. It was coming from the outer deep, not passing through it, not drifting, not tumbling on some ancient momentum, coming from it, moving with purpose, on a course that, if extended forward, would take it directly into the heart of known space. Corvinsil had spent 23 years exploring the outer deep. He knew every charted object in this sector. He knew the drift patterns of every large body within scanning range. He knew the gravitational fingerprints of every dead star, every rogue planet, every ancient debris field that had ever crossed his instruments. This object was not in any of his records. It was enormous. His initial scan put it at approximately 4 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide. Its surface was metallic, or at least partially metallic. There were irregular protrusions along its hull that could have been damage, or could have been design. Its trajectory was too precise to be accidental. Something was guiding it. Something inside it was still functioning. He zoomed his visual sensors to maximum resolution and waited the 17 seconds it took the system to process. The image that resolved on his screen made him go very, very still. It was a ship. Not a Caldren ship. Not a Vreth dreadnought. Not a blonde collective carrier or a Thessaly research vessel or any design he had ever seen in any database, ancient or modern. It was battered beyond description. Its hull was covered in something, a crust of debris and dust and what looked like crystallized energy signatures that had built up over an almost incomprehensible span of time. Parts of it were missing. Great chunks of its structure had been torn away, either by damage or by the slow erosion of whatever it had traveled through. Its engines, where they could still be identified, were dark and cold. No heat signature. No radiation. No active power source of any kind. But it was moving. It was moving steadily, purposefully, on a perfect course for the center of known space, and it was moving under no power that his instruments could detect. He stared at the image for a long time. Then he pulled up his oldest archive, the historical database that all Caldren explorers were required to carry, which contained the records of every known species in the galaxy, extinct or living, going back to the founding of the Galactic Compact. He searched for ship design profiles. He filtered by extinct species. He found the match in 11 seconds. The design profile, battered and ancient and nearly unrecognizable as anything, matched the recorded schematics of a vessel type last logged 20,000 years ago. The entry read: Species, Homo sapiens, human. Status: extinct, reclassified, Galactic Compact ruling 7 Alpha, current cycle. Last known vessel type, Arc-class deep space carrier. Length, 3.8 to 4.2 kilometers. Width, 0.8 to 1.1 kilometers. Crew capacity, 40,000 to 60,000. Corvinsil stared at the screen for a very long time. Then he opened a channel to the nearest relay station, which was 14 light minutes away, and he began to transmit. His voice, when it came out, was not quite steady. This is Explorer Corvinsil, Caldren Deep Survey, registration code KDIS 7714. I am transmitting from Sector Outer Deep 9, coordinate range 4 Theta 9er. I need to report a contact. An object on approach from deep space. I have confirmed a hull design match from the historical archive. He swallowed. The match is human. I repeat, the object matches human Arc-class design specifications. It appears to be a vessel. It appears to be intact. Partially intact. It is on a direct course for known space. I am not detecting any active power source, but the vessel is maintaining a precise navigational heading. He paused. I don't know if there's anyone on board. I don't know how this is possible. I don't know how anything about this is possible. But someone needs to know. Someone needs to. His voice broke slightly, not from fear but from something he couldn't name. Something that felt, somehow, like wonder. Someone needs to know that they're coming back. The message from Corvin Sill hit the relay network like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples moved fast. Within 6 hours, the message had reached the nearest Caldren colonial station, where it caused a minor administrative crisis because the duty officer couldn't find a protocol for how to handle a report of a possible human vessel. She searched through 14 filing systems and found nothing applicable. The closest thing was a standard procedure for anomalous deep space object contact, which was designed for debris fields and rogue asteroids. She used that one and forwarded the message up the chain, flagging it with every priority marker she could find. Within 18 hours, the message had reached the Caldren High Council scientific liaison, who read it twice, went pale, or the Caldren equivalent of pale, which involved their bioluminescent veins flickering rapidly, and immediately sent it to the Galactic Compact Emergency Communication Channel with a personal note that said, in essence, "I don't know what to do with this. Someone with more authority than me please handle it." Within 36 hours, Elder Counselor Zonveth Sara of the Vreth was reading Corvin Sill's message in his private chambers on Vreth Prime, and he was reading it very slowly and very carefully, because the words kept arranging themselves into something that his 300-year-old mind had been trained to resist. Oh, he did not allow himself to feel it. Not yet. Not until there was more data. Not until there was confirmation. But his hands as he set down the message were not quite steady. The Galactic Compact convened an emergency session within 48 hours of the initial transmission. It was the fastest convening in 3,000 years. Faster even than the emergency session called when the Pale Ones had attempted to weaponize a neutron star. This was a different kind of emergency. Not the kind that threatened destruction. The kind that threatened everything people thought they knew. 3 fleets were dispatched. The Vreth sent their fastest long-range cruiser, the Immutable Calculation, which was 3 kilometers long, bristled with sensors, and could travel at a speed that made most other ships look like they were standing still. The Caldren sent 2 research vessels, including the Pattern Recognition, the most sophisticated scientific vessel in their fleet. The Thessaly sent the Soft Inquiry, which sounded like a gentle name but was actually their standard first contact vessel, a heavily reinforced ship designed to survive almost any imaginable scenario. They also sent Thessaly Vorn. Nobody explicitly asked the ancient Uarshan to join the fleet. But she chartered her own vessel, a small, fast, deeply personal craft that she had owned for over 50,000 years, and she simply arrived at the rally point before anyone else. When Zahn's representative suggested, diplomatically, that the situation might be better handled by official personnel, she gave him a look that made him stop talking immediately. "I voted against their extinction," she said. "I will be there when they are found." No one argued. The journey to Sector Outer Deep 9 took 3 weeks at maximum speed. During those 3 weeks, the galaxy talked about nothing else. The news had leaked, it always leaked, and within days of the initial transmission, every civilization in known space was buzzing with the story. A human ship. A possible human ship. Coming from deep space. Coming back after 20,000 years. Reactions were varied. The younger species, those who had come to galactic awareness after the disappearance and knew humans only from historical records, treated it mostly as an abstract curiosity. A historical footnote possibly becoming a historical mystery. Interesting certainly. Worth watching. But not personal. The older species reacted very differently. The Vreth, who had traded extensively with humans during their expansion era, quietly ordered their defensive fleets to stand by. Not in an aggressive way. More in the way that you check that your door is locked when you hear something unexpected outside. Humans had been unpredictable. Even friendly, cooperative, genuinely warm humans had been capable of decisions that no logical species could have anticipated. The Vreth remembered this. They had a respectful, even fond, institutional memory of humanity, but they were also the kind of species that didn't take chances. The Morvathi said nothing publicly. The Morvathi never said anything publicly. But their intelligence services, which were considered the best in the galaxy by a very wide margin, went into something their analysts called elevated attention status, which basically meant that every available agent was pointed at the same question. What do we actually know about where humans went and how do we know it? The answer, infuriatingly, was almost nothing. The Thessaly published 17 academic papers about the discovery within the first week. Most of them were speculative, and 2 of them contradicted each other on fundamental points, and one of them concluded that the most likely explanation was that the ship was an automated drone that had been traveling for 20,000 years. This paper received a great deal of attention because it was the least interesting explanation and therefore the most comforting to people who found the alternative difficult to process. The alternative being that there were humans on that ship. Corvin Sill had not left his post. For 3 weeks, he had been sitting in his small survey vessel, watching the object on his instruments, transmitting regular updates to the approaching fleet, and trying very hard not to think too hard about what he was looking at. He had updated his measurements. The ship, he had started calling it a ship in his internal monologue, not an object, was indeed approximately 4.1 kilometers long. It was moving at a consistent speed of approximately 0.5% of light speed, which was slow by modern standards but represented an extraordinary amount of momentum for an object that appeared to have no active engines. Its trajectory had not deviated by a single measurable degree in 3 weeks. Something was guiding it. He had tried to communicate with it. He had transmitted on every frequency he knew, including several that were theoretically obsolete, old human communication bands that he dug out of the historical archive. He had sent mathematical sequences, light patterns, acoustic signals converted to radio waves. He had tried everything. He had received nothing back. But something had changed. 4 days ago, his instruments had picked up a faint thermal signature from within the ship. Extremely faint, barely above background noise. But it hadn't been there before. Or rather, it had been there, but it had been so faint that his first scans had filtered it out as noise. When he recalibrated his sensors specifically to hunt for it, he found that it had actually been there from the beginning. A tiny, persistent, almost impossibly faint source of heat, coming from deep inside the ship. He had not included this detail in his official updates. Not because he was hiding it, but because he wasn't sure what it meant, and he didn't want to send the galaxy into a full existential crisis based on what might be a malfunctioning reactor core. But privately, alone in his small dark survey vessel with his cup of rust-flavored coffee, he thought about what else generated that specific kind of heat signature. Organic, contained, distributed through a complex internal structure. Biology. Living things produced exactly that kind of heat. He sat and watched. He waited. He thought about Dr. Sarah Finch, who Thessaly Vorn had mentioned in a speech he'd read in a history archive once. A human who had cried over beautiful microscopic creatures. He thought about what 20,000 years meant. Really meant. Not as a number. As a lived experience. 20,000 years of what? Where? Oh. He had no answers. But he kept watching. He kept the channel open. Just in case. The fleet arrived in stages. The immutable calculation arrived first because it was fastest, and because the Vreth had a cultural compulsion to arrive first at anything that might be important. Its senior xenological officer, a four-armed Vreth named Karithson, took one look at the ship on her sensors and went completely still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she very quietly asked her assistant to confirm the hull design match. The assistant confirmed it. "Begin full-spectrum analysis," Karithson said in a voice that was entirely controlled and professional. "I want readings on everything: thermal, EM, gravitational, radiation, biological. Full sweep. And open a direct channel to Elder Zahn." "What should I tell him?" "Tell him." She paused. "Tell him that the ship is real. Tell him that it's in better condition than the initial report suggested. Tell him that I am detecting." Another pause. Longer this time. "Tell him that I need to speak with him privately before the full fleet arrives." The assistant sent the message. The private call with Elder Zahn lasted 47 minutes. No one else was present. No one else knew what was said. But when the pattern recognition and soft inquiry arrived 6 hours later, and Thessaly Vorn's small personal vessel arrived 40 minutes after that, Karithson was waiting at the edge of the gathering fleet with an expression that no one could quite read. Not fear. Not excitement. Something older than both. "What do you have?" Thessaly Vorn asked the moment she established a calm link. "We should speak in person," Karithson said. "Then speak quickly because I am 312,000 years old and I have been waiting for this for a very long time." Karithson looked at the ancient Uarshan for a moment. Then she said, "The thermal signature is not from a reactor. We ran 17 analysis cycles. We brought in every model we have for dead reactor signatures, decay signatures, chemical reactions, crystalline energy storage systems. None of them match." "What does it match?" Thessaly Vorn asked. Karithson's 4 arms crossed in a gesture that, in Vreth body language, signified something between reverence and disbelief. "It matches biological metabolic signatures," she said. "Distributed throughout approximately 60% of the ship's interior volume. Faint. Extremely faint. But consistent. consistent with hibernation, Thessaly Vorn said softly. Karathin blinked all three of her eyes. How did you know? Because, said the ancient Uarshan, they were always smarter than anyone gave them credit for. The fleet held position at a distance of approximately 20,000 kilometers from the ship, close enough for detailed scanning but far enough that they weren't in any immediate collision risk if the ship changed course unexpectedly. They named it, because it needed a name and because the historical archive provided one, the UNHS Perseverance, based on the partial registry code that their deepest penetrating sensors had finally managed to read from the hull beneath 20,000 years of accumulated debris. UNHS, United Nations Humanity Ship. A designation format that had been standard for human Ark-class vessels during their expansion era. The Perseverance. It was a good name for a ship that had been traveling for 20,000 years. It was an even better name for a species that had apparently refused to simply stop existing. The scientific teams worked in shifts around the clock, running every analysis they could think of. They mapped the ship's interior as best they could through the hull, which was nearly a meter thick in places and lined with materials that made deep scanning difficult. They identified internal compartments. They identified structural systems, many of which were damaged. They identified what appeared to be a power generation system that was running on something so slow and so minimal that it barely registered as active. But it was active. Something, somewhere inside that ship, was keeping a tiny, precious flicker of power alive. They argued about whether to approach. The argument was fierce, principled, and went on for 3 days. The Vreth position. Approach cautiously, attempt contact first, do not board without clear invitation or established communication. The Caldren position. Approach cautiously, attempt contact, prepare a boarding team for a potential rescue operation if the biological signatures indicated distress. The Thessaly position. Publish a paper about what they were seeing, then approach cautiously. Thessaly Vorn's position. They have been alone for 20,000 years. We're going. Now. The fleet commanders looked at each other. They went. The approach took 14 hours at minimum speed, because the Perseverance was still moving, still maintaining its course, and matching speed with it while getting close enough for a visual inspection required careful calculation and extraordinary patience. The visual inspection, when they finally got close enough, was devastating. Not in a tragic way. In the way that something scarred and damaged and ancient can be devastating simply through the sheer testimony of its endurance. The Perseverance was covered in history. Its hull, originally a deep gunmetal gray according to the historical records, was layered with 20,000 years of accumulated material. Cosmic dust. Microimpacts. A crust of crystalline compounds that had formed from reactions between its hull material and the particles of deep space. Some sections showed the scarring of ancient impacts, not recent collisions but impacts that had happened long ago, leaving marks that had been slowly covered by subsequent layers of time. Parts of its superstructure were simply gone. 2 of its primary engine nacelles were missing entirely, sheared off cleanly as though cut by something enormous. A section of its upper hull, perhaps 300 meters long, had been folded inward at an angle that spoke of tremendous force applied from outside. One of its observation domes, a transparent section that, according to records human ships had used for direct visual observation of space, was cracked, the transparent material cloudy with age but somehow still intact. Its running lights were off. Its navigation beacons were dark. Its communication arrays were either destroyed or non-functional. It was dark and silent and still. But it was moving. Steadily, precisely, impossibly toward home. Corvin Sill, who had been watching this thing for almost a month now, found that he had nothing to say when they finally got close enough to see it properly with direct optical sensors. He just looked at it. He looked at the ancient, battered, impossible hull. He looked at the places where the metal had been scored and torn and healed over with improvised patches. Improvised repairs, done during the journey, done by whoever was on board, done 20,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Someone had been taking care of this ship. Someone had been keeping it going. Someone had wanted very badly to come home. He felt something he couldn't name. Not quite grief. Not quite joy. Something in between, something that had no word in Caldren, but he suspected, based on the records he'd been reading for the past 3 weeks, that humans had a word for it. He thought the word might be yearning. They found the airlock on the ship's port side, roughly a third of the way from the bow. It took 2 days to find it, not because it was hidden, but because so much of the hull had been covered and reshaped by 20,000 years of accumulation that identifying the original architecture was like trying to read a book through layers of mud. The Vreth scientific team had to cross-reference their findings with historical blueprints of human Ark-class vessels. And even then, the match was imperfect, because the Perseverance had clearly been modified extensively over the course of its long journey. Systems had been relocated. New structures had been built inside and occasionally outside the original hull. The ship they were looking at was not quite the ship that had been built. It had evolved, adapted, survived, like its crew. The airlock, when they finally located it, was approximately 12 meters wide, large enough for a substantial boarding party, though it would have been designed for cargo loading and crew transfers rather than anything combat-related. Its outer door was sealed. Its external control panel was either destroyed or buried under the crust of accumulated material that covered most of the hull. "We could burn through," suggested Lieutenant Vethrail of the immutable calculation, meaning they could use one of the Vreth cruiser's cutting lasers to open the door manually. "We are not cutting our way into their ship," said Thessaly Vorn, with a flatness in her voice that ended the conversation immediately. What they tried instead was more patient and more respectful. A team from the Soft Inquiry, the Thessaly first contact vessel, specialized in precisely this kind of work. They sent a 6-person team across in a small shuttle, equipped with tools designed for exactly this scenario, accessing the external systems of a vessel whose crew could not respond. They worked carefully, methodically, removing the accumulated material from around the control panel without damaging the underlying structure. They cataloged everything they removed. The Thessaly had strong feelings about documentation. The process took 16 hours. When they finally cleared the control panel and examined it, they found something unexpected. The panel was still powered. Barely. A trickle of current so thin that it was practically a ghost. But it was there, and it meant that somewhere inside this ship, that impossible little flicker of power was feeding every system it could still reach, including the airlock controls. The lead Thessaly technician, a being named Sorithvel, studied the panel for a long time. The interface was completely unfamiliar to her, human technology 20,000 years old, designed for human hands and human cognition. But she had spent the past 2 weeks studying every surviving record of human technology she could find, and she had a theoretical understanding of at least the underlying principles. She looked at the panel. She looked at her notes. She pressed what she believed was the external request signal, the equivalent of knocking. She waited. Nothing happened for 40 seconds. Then very slowly, a single light on the panel shifted from dark to a dim amber glow. The channel was open. She pressed the audio transmit. "Hello," she said in standard Galactic, then repeated it in the 3 human languages the archive considered most likely to still be in use: English, Mandarin, Spanish. "We are from the Galactic Compact. We have detected your vessel. We are here to help. Please respond if you are able." Silence. She tried again in more languages: French, Arabic, Hindi, Portuguese, Russian, Japanese, German. She went through every human language in the historical archive, 16 in total, even the ones that were believed to have been minority languages at the time of the disappearance. She was methodical. She was patient. She was Thessaly. On the 17th attempt, in a language called Swahili, which the archive noted had been spoken by roughly 200 million humans at the time of disappearance, the light on the panel changed. From amber to green. And a sound came through the audio channel. Not words. Not language. Just a sound. A long, low exhalation. The kind of sound that a creature makes when it has been holding something in for a very, very long time and has finally been given permission to let it go. Sorithvel's hands were not steady when she sent the transmission back to the fleet. "The airlock is responding," she said. "There is someone there." The inner door of the airlock opened 7 hours later. 7 hours was a long time to wait. It was not a long time, however, when you considered what that waiting represented. Whoever was on the other side of that door had been traveling for 20,000 years. 7 hours more was nothing. 7 hours was the blink of an eye. 7 hours was courtesy. They waited. The fleet gathered virtually, every senior officer and scientist and diplomat, connected through a shared communication network, watching the feed from the camera that Sorithvel's team had mounted near the airlock. The feed was low resolution in the darkness, illuminated only by the team's external lights and the faint glow of the panel. Thessaly Vorn watched alone, in her small personal vessel, in a chair she had been sitting in for 300,000 years. Corvin Sill watched from his survey vessel, still parked at the edge of the gathering fleet, still holding his cold cup of rust-flavored coffee. Karethson watched from the bridge of the immutable calculation, flanked by her senior staff, in a silence so complete that the ambient hum of the ship's engines seemed very loud. And then the inner door opened. It opened slowly, very slowly, moving in stages as though the mechanism was stiff from disuse or from damage, as though whatever was on the other side was using whatever strength it had left to force it. Light spilled out. Not much light. It was dim amber, the color of old metal and low power. But it was there. The interior of the ship was lit at least partially. At least enough. A shape appeared in the doorway. It was small. That was the first thing that registered. The shape was small. Not tiny but unmistakably the size of a being rather than a piece of machinery. It moved slowly, leaning against the doorframe with one hand. It seemed unsteady, uncertain, as though it hadn't used its legs in a long time. The camera adjusted, sharpening the image. The shape became a figure. The figure became a person. She was young. Or she looked young, though young was a complicated concept when applied to a species that no one had seen in 20,000 years. She appeared to be in her mid-20s by human biological standards. Her skin was dark brown. Her hair was long and loose and had clearly not been cut in a very long time. She was wearing a suit that was unmistakably utilitarian, close-fitting, layered, covered in patches and repairs, the kind of garment that had been kept functional through sheer stubborn maintenance rather than ever being replaced. Her eyes were dark and very wide. She looked at the external lights of the Thessaly team. She looked at the suited figures of Sorithvel and her colleagues. She looked at the alien faces behind the visors. Her mouth moved. No sound came through immediately, either she wasn't transmitting or the channel wasn't picking her up. Then Sorithvel adjusted the feed and the sound resolved and they heard her voice. She was speaking in English. "Are you real?" she asked. Her voice was rough from disuse. It cracked on the second word. But it was unmistakably a voice. A real, living human voice, asking a question that no one in the fleet had quite expected. Sorithvel looked at her own team. She looked at the camera knowing the entire fleet was watching. She had prepared for many possible first scenarios. She had not specifically prepared for this one. She switched to English. Her pronunciation was imperfect, pulled from the historical archive, but understandable. "Yes," she said. "We are real. We have found you. You are safe." The young woman in the doorway was quiet for a moment. She looked at the suited figures for a long time with those very wide dark eyes. Then she pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the door, not urgently, not in distress, but slowly, deliberately, like someone placing their hand on something solid to make sure it doesn't disappear. "Okay," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Okay, good. She paused, swallowed. "I need to tell the captain. Can you?" Another pause. She seemed to be gathering herself from someplace very far away. "Can you wait a few more minutes? She needs to be awake for this." The captain. There was a captain. There was a she. "We can wait," Sorithvel said carefully. "Take whatever time you need. We are not going anywhere." The young woman nodded. Then, before she stepped back from the door, she said one more thing. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming. We weren't sure anyone would. We weren't sure anyone was still." She stopped. "Just, thank you." She disappeared back into the dim amber interior of the ship. The door remained open. In the fleet, no one spoke for a very long time. It was Thessaly Vorn who finally broke the silence from her small personal vessel, and what she said was not something she meant to transmit broadly, it was something she said quietly to herself, in the ancient language of the Uarshan that predated the Galactic Compact by 100,000 years. But her channel was still open and the translators caught it. What she said, translated into Standard Galactic, was, "I told you." Her name was Maya Chin, and she had been captain of the UNHS Perseverance for 14 years. She was 53 years old. She had been born on the ship. She came through the airlock door 40 minutes after the young woman had retreated into the ship's interior. She was tall, taller than the young woman, taller than most of the historical records suggested was average for humans, though the fleet doctors would later determine that this was likely a result of low-gravity adaptation over generations. She was lean. Her hair was black with threads of gray and pulled back in a tight, practical arrangement. Her skin was a warm tan. Her face had the kind of lines that came not from age alone but from sustained concentration, the specific geography of a face that had spent decades making hard decisions. She wore the same kind of patched, layered suit as the young woman, but hers had additional markings, a designation on the left breast, partially worn away but still legible, Captain. And below that, the registration of the ship, UNHS Perseverance, Arc Class Reg. 0047 Terra. She walked steadily. Not quite steadily, there was a slight hesitation in her gait, a careful deliberateness, The way someone walks when they are making an effort to appear steadier than they feel. She stopped just inside the airlock and looked at the Thessaly team. Her eyes were black, deep, still, and very hard to read. She looked at Sorthvel for a long moment. Then she looked at the camera. She'd clearly been told about the camera, or had spotted it herself. She looked directly into it, knowing that whatever she looked like, whoever was watching would see her. She stood straight. "I'm Captain Maya Chen," she said. Her English was clean, accent neutral, the kind that came from a ship where language had been carefully maintained through recordings and education. "Acting Commander of the UNHS Perseverance. We are traveling under the authority of the Earth Continuity Mission, authorized under United Nations Emergency Resolution 7 Omega, issued approximately 19,984 years ago." Pause. "I understand that's a long time." The understatement was so profound that several members of the fleet's observation crew actually laughed, and then immediately felt strange about having laughed, and then felt that the strangeness was probably appropriate because what else could you do when someone said something like that? "We're glad to find you," Sorthvel said. "Or rather, we're glad that you found us. You've traveled very far." "Yes," said Maya Chen. "We have." Something moved across her face at that, something deep and complicated and old. "How long have you been following the ship?" "Approximately 5 weeks from the initial sighting." "And before that? Did anyone notice us approaching before that?" "No," Sorthvel said gently. "The initial detection was approximately 5 weeks ago. By one of our deep survey explorers, Corvinsil. 5 weeks, said Maya. She absorbed this. "We've been sending the homing signal for about 800 years. The equipment kept failing. We kept repairing it. I wasn't sure it was still transmitting. I wasn't sure there was anyone left to hear it. There was a silence in the airlock that felt very large. There is someone left," Sorthvel said carefully. "The Galactic Compact has 47 member civilizations. The galaxy is well populated." Maya Chen nodded slowly. "What about Earth?" Another silence. This one was different. This one had weight. Sorthvel hesitated, and Maya Chen saw the hesitation, and something in her expression did not change. She had clearly anticipated this, had prepared herself for this, had been preparing herself for this for a long time. "I understand if the answer is difficult," Maya said. "I've been captain for 14 years. Before me, my mother was captain. Before her, her father. We've had 6 captains since the mission began. We've been preparing for this conversation for most of our journey. We know things may have changed. We know the news might not be." "Earth is intact," Sorthvel said. Maya Chen stopped speaking. She looked at the Thessaly researcher. "Earth is intact," Sorthvel repeated. "It is. There has been change, significant change, over 20,000 years. But the planet is there. The biosphere has recovered significantly from the damage of the departure era. There are other species living there now, descendant species of Earth's fauna, evolved significantly. There is an observational presence maintained by the Galactic Compact. The planet is inhabited," Maya asked very quietly. "Not by humans," Sorthvel said as gently as she could. "Not by humans for 20,000 years. But it lives. The planet lives." Maya Chen was quiet for a long time. The fleet watched her. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She did not show anything that could be called a dramatic breakdown. What she did was something quieter and in some ways more devastating. She pressed her lips together very slightly. She looked past Sorthvel, past the suited figures, past the external lights of the shuttle, into the darkness of space. Her eyes moved to something that no one else could see, something interior, something only she knew was there. Then she looked back. "Okay," she said. The same word the young woman had used. "Okay." She exhaled slowly. "We have 4,317 people on this ship. Most of them are still in hibernation. We've been rotating a skeleton crew, about 100 people awake at any given time, working in 4-month shifts. We have medical situations that need attention. We have," she stopped, "reorganized. We have 4,317 reasons to keep going. So, what do we do next?" And in that moment, in that single declarative sentence, in that immediate practical pivot from devastating personal loss to the needs of her crew, something happened across the fleet that no one quite expected. They understood, viscerally and immediately, what the old records had been trying to tell them. This was what humans were. This was the thing that couldn't be catalogued or archived or reduced to historical data. Not the technology. Not the ships. Not the expansion across the stars. A woman who has just been told her species' home world is empty, who is standing in the airlock of a ship she has kept alive for 20,000 years, who is 53 years old and has never known any world but this battered hull of metal and memory, and she pivots. She asks what comes next. She counts her people. She does not stop. Thessaly Vorn, watching from her personal vessel, felt something move through her that she had not felt in a very long time. Something warm and sharp and painful in the best possible way. She pressed her hand flat against the wall of her ship. There you are, she thought. I knew you weren't gone. The boarding process was careful and slow and conducted with extraordinary sensitivity. Sorethvel's team, joined over the following hours by representatives from the Vreth and Kaldren ships, began the work of understanding what they were dealing with. Maya Chen was their primary contact, and she was systematic, clear-headed, and deeply prepared. She explained, spent most of the past 6 months preparing for this exact scenario. She had logs of the ship's current system status. She had a medical report on the hibernating crew. She had a list of priority needs, organized by urgency. She had clearly been expecting this. Not certainly. Not with confidence. But she had prepared for it the way humans apparently prepared for everything, as if it were going to happen whether they were ready or not. The medical situation was serious but not catastrophic. The hibernation systems had been functioning for most of the journey, but they were old, jury-rigged, repaired hundreds of times over thousands of years, and a significant percentage of the hibernation pods had failed over the course of the journey. When pods had failed, depending on the era and the available resources, the people inside had either been transferred to functional pods or— Maya said this part quietly without looking away, without letting her voice break, or they had been lost. How many had they lost? At departure, the ship had carried approximately 52,000 people. They had 4,317 now. The fleet absorbed this number in silence. Almost 48,000 people, lost over 20,000 years to the slow, grinding attrition of equipment failure, medical crises, accidents, and the 1,000 other ways that existence could end in the dark. Nearly 90% of the people who had started this journey. Maya Chen told them this fact the way a person tells a fact they have made peace with, not easily, not without pain, but with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from having accepted something so large that to not accept it would mean not being able to function at all. We kept records, she said. Every person. Every name. Every date. We have the records going back to departure. All 48,000 people who didn't make it are documented. We know who they were. We know what they contributed. We know, she paused briefly. We know their names. She said this as though it were the most important thing she'd told them. Because perhaps it was. The young woman who had first opened the airlock was named Zara Williams. She was 24 years old. She was the ship's navigator, or more precisely, she was the current rotation's navigator, trained from childhood for the role, as every crew member was trained for their role. She was third-generation crew, meaning she had not been born in hibernation. She had been born to parents who were part of the skeleton crew rotation, parents who had spent their lives awake on the ship, and she had grown up in the living sections of the Perseverance among about 200 other always-awake crew members. She was, therefore, one of the very few people on the ship who had never known what it was like to sleep for decades at a stretch, to wake confused and stiff and slow, to experience time as a series of long gaps interrupted by brief, disorienting bouts of consciousness. She had always been awake. She had spent her entire life in this ship, in these corridors, under these lights. She was the first person in 20,000 years to have looked out the ship's surviving observation windows and watched the stars of known space get closer. I was 7 when I first understood what the mission was, she told Sorethvel, during one of the early conversations that the Thessaly researcher was having with individual crew members. My dad explained it to me. He sat me down and he showed me the star charts and he said, Zara, do you know what we're doing? And I said, flying? And he said, we're going home. She paused. I didn't really understand what that meant. I'd never had a home except the ship. None of the awake crew kids had. The ship was home. But he made it sound so important. Home. Like it was the most important word in the universe. So I believed him. And I studied navigation. And I kept the course. She looked at Sorethvel with dark, quiet eyes. What's it like? She asked. The galaxy. What's it like out there? Sorethvel thought about how to answer that. It's very large, she said finally. And very old. And quite full of people who are very interested in meeting you. Zara considered this. Are they afraid of us? Some of them are cautious, Sorethvel admitted. You've been gone for a very long time. Some of the species who remember you have complicated feelings about the memory. Are they afraid of us specifically? Zara asked with a directness that was, somehow, unmistakably human. Or are they afraid of what we represent? Sorithvel was quiet for a moment. What do you think you represent? Zara thought about it. Uncertainty, she said. We represent the possibility that something can happen that nobody planned for. That a whole species can just vanish. Or in our case, not vanish. Come back. She paused. That's scary for species that like to think they understand how things work. Are all humans this perceptive? Sorithvel asked. Zara smiled for the first time. It was a brief smile, quick and genuine, and it changed her face completely. Some are smarter than me and some are dumber. But we're all pretty good at reading the room. We kind of had to be, historically. What the Perseverance carried, beyond its 4,000 people, was a question that occupied the scientific teams for weeks. The answer, when they began to piece it together, was staggering. The ship was an archive. Not just of DNA and biological samples, though it had those carefully maintained genetic libraries representing thousands of Earth species. Not just of cultural records, though it had those too. A vast digital and physical archive of human knowledge, art, history, language, and science, maintained and expanded over 20,000 years. Not just of technology, though the ship's engineering represented a fascinating fusion of ancient human design with 20,000 years of isolated innovation, solving problems with no outside help and no access to the wider galactic knowledge base. All of those things were there. But what the ship carried most essentially was memory. Memory of what it had been. Memory of what it had seen. Memory of where it had gone. Because the Perseverance had not simply been hiding or running or drifting. It had been somewhere. And that somewhere had changed everything. Captain Maya Chin did not bring this up immediately. In the first days of contact, she was focused entirely on the immediate priorities: medical assessment, crew welfare, basic logistics, establishing trust. She was methodical and careful and deeply aware that the relationship between her ship and the gathering fleet was new and fragile and needed to be handled with patience. But on the fourth day, she asked to speak privately with Thessaly Vorn. Thessaly Vorn came aboard. She came aboard the Perseverance through the airlock, accompanied by no one, which was her own insistence. The airlock was barely large enough to accommodate her, and her biomechanical augmentations made the passage awkward, but she managed it with the particular dignity of someone who has had 300,000 years to practice moving through difficult spaces. She stepped into the ship. The smell hit her first, the indefinable, complex smell of a living space. Recycled air, human biology, the specific chemical signature of old equipment kept functional through constant maintenance, something organic and green that turned out to be a series of hydroponic gardens that filled one entire deck, providing both food and oxygen throughout the journey. But underneath all of it, something else. Something she recognized from very long ago, from the time she had actually been among humans on human stations and human ships. The smell of people who had been somewhere together for a very long time. It wasn't unpleasant. It was dense. Rich. The smell of history compressed into a single space. Maya Chin met her in a corridor just inside the airlock. The two of them looked at each other for a moment. The ancient alien, taller than any human had ever been, her body a layered archaeology of biological and mechanical integration, her amber eyes old beyond comprehension, and the human woman, middle-aged, scarred by years of hard captaincy, dark-eyed and steady. You voted against our extinction, Maya said. Yes, said Thessaly Vorn. Every session for 12,000 years. Maya nodded slowly. Why? The ancient Uarshan considered the question. Because I remembered you. And because I did not believe that a species which had found beauty in so many unexpected places would simply cease to exist without leaving a mark. Maya was quiet for a moment. We left a mark, she said. I know. That's why I'm here. They moved into the ship. Maya led her through corridors that had been built and rebuilt and modified over 20,000 years, corridors that were lined with photographs, real physical photographs, printed on materials that would last, thousands of them, covering the walls in overlapping layers. Faces, families, groups, moments. Maya explained them as they walked. Every person who was ever on this ship, she said. Every person. We started the photograph wall in about year 200. The captain at the time, our fourth captain, Amara Osei, she said we needed to see each other. Every generation, every crew member, every person who was born on this ship or woke up on this ship at some point. She said as long as we could see each other's faces on the walls, we wouldn't forget who we were. Thessaly Vorn walked slowly looking at the faces. Thousands of faces. Generations of faces. Children and old people and middle-aged people and faces that were clearly mixes of genetic heritage from every corner of the original human population. "You're all here," she said quietly. "The ones who made it are," Maya said. "The ones who didn't are here too. Different section." She gestured ahead. "We call it the Memorial Hall. We built it about 800 years in, when the losses started to accumulate fast enough that we needed a specific place for grief." They reached the Memorial Hall. It was a long, wide space near the ship's center, clearly carved from what had originally been a storage area, repurposed over hundreds of years into something entirely different. The walls were covered with names. Not photographs here, names. Written in small, careful text, starting near the entrance with names that must have dated back to the early years of the journey, and running all the way down the length of the hall to a far wall that was still partially empty. Below each name, a date. Below the date, a few words. Not long, just a few words. An occupation. A relationship. A single thing remembered. James Okafor. Year 347. Engineer. He always hummed while he worked. Lin Zhao. Year 1082. Teacher. She taught our children to love books. Marcus Santos. Year 3440. Doctor. He saved 47 lives before his own ended. Thessaly Vorn stood in the memorial hall and looked at the walls of names for a very long time. 48,000, she said finally. Give or take, said Maya. The early records are incomplete. We did our best. You remembered them all. Every one. Maya's voice was quiet and steady. Because they were ours. Because they mattered. Because, she paused looking at the names. Because if you stop remembering you're dead, you stop knowing who you are. Thessaly Vorn turned to look at the captain. Where did you go? She asked. Not accusingly. Not impatiently. Simply. With 300,000 years of patience behind the question. And Maya Chin told her. The story took 3 hours to tell. Maya used the ship's records, logs, charts, sensor data, crew journals, to supplement her own account, which was itself a combination of personal knowledge and the inherited institutional memory of 6 captains' worth of leadership. The full picture assembled from all of these sources was this. 20,000 years ago, roughly accounting for the imprecision of calendar reconciliation across such a span of time, humanity had not disappeared. Humanity had run. Not in cowardice. Not in chaos. Not as a surrender. They had run because they had seen what was coming, and they had made a choice, and the choice had cost them everything and possibly saved everything simultaneously. What was coming had no official name in any existing record, because the humans had not known what to call it. They had names for it in their crew journals. In the human informal way they had called it many things depending on who was writing and when. The thing. The wave. The dark. The end of the argument. That last one had apparently been coined by a physicist in year 3 of the journey, and it had stuck. What it was, as best as the scientific teams could reconstruct from the 20,000-year-old sensor data in the Perseverance's logs, was an event. A phenomenon. Something moving through the galaxy at the time of humanity's disappearance. Something that the humans had detected, that they had analyzed, and that they had determined was going to be very, very bad for anyone who stayed in known space. What kind of phenomenon? Karathin asked when Maya Chen's account was being relayed to the fleet. Our scientists called it a cascade event, Maya said. A propagating wave of, I'm going to use their terminology which is 20,000-year-old human physics so please correct me if my translation is off, a wave of spatial quantum collapse. Basically, a region of space where the fundamental physical constants were being altered. Not everywhere. Not permanently. But in a front that was moving through the galaxy. A spatial cascade event, said the Vretha's chief physicist who had been listening to the relay. We have theoretical models for such an event. We've never observed one. But the theory, if the constants were actually changing. Everything built on the standard physics breaks down, said Karathin. Energy systems. Drive systems. Life support. She paused. The biological processes of most known life forms. Most, said Maya. Not all. Our scientists had some ideas about why humans might have a slightly better resistance to the early stages. Something about our specific metabolic chemistry. We were given a narrow window, not immunity but enough time to move if we moved immediately, and if we moved in a very specific direction. Toward the outer deep, said Corvinsil from his survey vessel. Away from the front, Maya confirmed. The cascade was moving inward toward the galactic core. Moving outward, moving into the deep, uncharted regions, was moving away from it. We didn't know how far we'd have to go. We didn't know if we'd survive the journey. We didn't know if we'd ever be able to come back. She paused. We knew that if we stayed we would definitely die. Why didn't you tell anyone? This question came from Elder Zahn, transmitted from Vreth Prime. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that might have been an ancient grievance. Maya looked at the camera that was relaying to him. The reports say we tried. The historical logs, our own records, show that humanity's leadership transmitted warnings to the Galactic Compact. Multiple warnings over approximately 6 months before the departure. The records we have suggest that the warnings were received, that they were analyzed, that the conclusion, at least among the species represented in the compact at that time, was that the cascade event was, she chose her words carefully, was considered unlikely to be as severe as human models predicted. A very long silence. We were dismissed, she said. Not maliciously. Our science was less developed than several of the older species. Our models were considered less reliable. And we were predicting something that had never been observed before. There were debates apparently. There was skepticism. And then, we ran out of time for debate. So you left, said Zahn. So we left. All of us that could. 52,000 people, on the largest ships we could launch in the time we had. Not just the Perseverance. We launched a fleet. She paused. We were the only ship that made it out of the system before the Cascade front reached that region of space. The silence that followed that sentence was different from all the other silences. The other ships, Karithson said carefully. Lost, said Maya. As far as we know. We lost contact with all other human vessels within 6 months of departure. Whether that was from the Cascade, from navigation failures, from other causes, we don't know. We were alone from very early on. 52,000 people in one ship, heading into space that no one had ever charted, running from something we weren't even sure we fully understood. She sat back slightly. We found somewhere to wait, she said. That's the short version. There's a region, our charts call it the still pocket. It's a region of space so far into the outer deep that the Cascade event never reached it. The physics there are stable but different. Slightly different constants in a few key areas. Nothing that prevents life or basic technology, but different enough that our drives didn't work the same way. We couldn't leave. We were there for. She looked at her notes. We were there for approximately 18,700 years. Waiting for the Cascade to subside. Waiting for readings that told us the galaxy was stable enough to come back to. 18,000 years, Corvin Sill said softly from his survey vessel. 18,000 years, Maya confirmed. Our scientists monitored the front. They developed new instruments. They took measurements. They built models. They passed the knowledge down generation to generation. And approximately 1,200 years ago, 1,200 years ago from now, they determined that the Cascade had dissipated. That known space was stable again. Why did it take 1,200 more years to reach us? Sorthvel asked. Because the drives were damaged when we finally managed to leave the still pocket, Maya said simply. We could only travel at a fraction of our original speed. We made repairs as we went. We lost more people. We kept going. She looked at the camera. We kept going because stopping wasn't an option. We had 4,300 people left and a ship that had no business still being in one piece, and we kept going. She met the camera with steady eyes. We kept going because we had promised. Promised who? Asked Thessaly Vorn, who was still aboard the ship, sitting in a chair that had been brought to the memorial hall for her. Maya Chen looked at the old alien and something in her face shifted, not broke but shifted like a door opening just slightly. We promised them, she said, gesturing at the walls of names. Every person on these walls. Everyone we lost along the way. They didn't get to make it home. So we made it home for them. She paused. And we promised ourselves. And the people sleeping in those hibernation pods. And the people who will come after us, however many there are. A breath. We promised. Thessaly Vorn reached out and placed her ancient, augmented hand on the wall of names. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. What Maya Chen had described as the end of the argument, the Cascade event, became the most urgent scientific question in the galaxy the moment her account was relayed to the Galactic Compact. Because it raised two questions that no one could answer. The first, had the Cascade event actually happened? And if so, why did no one in the galaxy's long history know about it? The second, was it coming back? The first question, it turned out, had an answer. A very uncomfortable one. Elder Zanveth Sara, when informed of the Cascade event's description, spent 48 hours in private consultation with the Vreth Grand Archive, the single most comprehensive database of historical astronomical data in known space, maintained without interruption for over 900,000 years. He found the cascade event in the archive. Not labeled as a cascade event. Not labeled as anything connected to human disappearance. Labeled, in the records of approximately 20,000 years ago, as anomalous quantum field fluctuation, outer spiral arm, believed localized, duration approximately 14 Earth centuries, resolved. Believed localized. The Vreth scientists of 20,000 years ago had detected the cascade. They had analyzed it. They had determined, incorrectly, that it was a localized phenomenon that wouldn't affect the inner parts of known space. And they had filed it. And moved on. The humans tried to warn them, Corvinsil said, when this information was shared with the fleet. The humans tried to warn us, said Karithsin heavily. They tried to warn us and we didn't listen and they had to run. And your species survived because you ran, Sorithvel pointed out. If the cascade had been as severe as human models predicted. It was exactly as severe as their models predicted, said Zahn's voice from Vreth Prime. I have now cross-referenced the Vreth archive data with the sensor logs from the Perseverance. The cascade event was precisely as powerful as human science had calculated. The wave front progressed through the outer spiral arm, through what would have been human space, and dissipated approximately 1400 years after the human departure. Our records of that period show. He paused. Show what? Several people asked simultaneously. Show that approximately 12% of all non-human life in the outer spiral arm died in the period corresponding to the cascade event's passage, Zahn said. The records attributed it at the time to a succession of unrelated causes. Disease, stellar events, ecosystem collapse. They didn't recognize it as a single connected phenomenon. A long silence. 12%, said Thessaly Vorn from aboard the Perseverance. The civilizations in the deep inner spiral were largely protected by distance and by a natural barrier of stellar mass that attenuated the effect. Most of the Galactic Compact's founding species are inner spiral civilizations. They felt the edge of it. They attributed the losses to other causes. He paused again. The humans were the only civilization in the affected region sophisticated enough to detect the true nature of what was happening. They were also the only ones who chose to run. They tried to warn everyone else, Corvinsil said again very quietly. And we did not listen, said Zahn. And 12% of outer spiral life died. And humanity went into exile for 20,000 years. He was quiet for a moment. The memorial we are currently building to honor them as an extinct species seems, in retrospect, to be somewhat premature. Cancel it, said Thessaly Vorn flatly. Yes, said Zahn. The second question, was it coming back, took longer to address. And the answer, when it came, was the most significant thing the fleet had encountered since the Perseverance itself. Because the Perseverance had data that no one else had. 20,000 years of data. Detailed, methodical, generation after generation scientific observation of the cascade event's behavior, from the one vantage point that had been outside it the entire time, the still pocket deep in the outer deep. The humans had watched the cascade from outside. They had measured it. They had modeled it. They had developed an understanding of it that was, by necessity, the most comprehensive in existence, because they were the ones whose survival had depended on understanding it. And their models suggested something that the Vreth archive, with its incomplete inner spiral data, had no way of knowing. The cascade was cyclical. It had happened before. Not once, not twice. It was a recurring phenomenon, arising from deep galactic mechanisms that operated on timescales of approximately 30,000 years. It came from the core, moved outward through the spiral arms, and dissipated in the deep outer regions. It had happened before recorded galactic history. It would happen again. In approximately 10,000 years. Maya Chen presented this finding in a formal session with the full fleet, sitting at a table in one of the Perseverance's larger communal spaces, a room that had clearly served as a gathering place for the ship's community for thousands of years, its walls covered in the same layered photography as the corridors. Our science team projects the next event in approximately 9,800 to 10,200 years, she said. Give or take, because the variables at play are extraordinary. The margin of error is several centuries. She looked around at the alien faces, the Vreth, the Kaldren, the Tesserae, the others connected by relay. We ran last time, she said. Most of us didn't make it. And we didn't have time to share what we knew or make proper preparations. She paused. We have 10,000 years this time. We have the data. We have the science. And we are not, she looked directly into the camera for Zahn. We are not going to let what happened last time happen again. Zahn's voice was quiet and very careful when he spoke. What do you propose? Maya Chin looked at her navigator, Zara Williams, who was sitting beside her. Zara gave the smallest nod. We propose, said Maya Chin, a joint project. All species. All available science. 10,000 years to develop a countermeasure or an early warning system, or an evacuation protocol for the entire affected region. She paused. We've been alone for 20,000 years. We've learned what that costs. We would very much prefer not to be alone again. Another silence. This one felt different from all the others. This one felt like a beginning. We accept, said Elder Zonveth Sara. The process of bringing the hibernating crew out of stasis was a project of extraordinary delicacy, conducted over the course of 3 weeks with the combined medical resources of the fleet and the Perseverance's own medical team. A team of 12 people who had, over the course of generations, become specialists in a medical practice that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Human cryogenic medicine. The specific science of keeping a biological organism in suspended animation for decades, sometimes centuries, and then bringing it back. The Vreth and Kaldren medical teams had observed human hibernation systems in the historical records and had access to theoretical models, but nothing prepared them for the reality of the Perseverance's hibernation bays. The ship had 12 primary hibernation bays, each holding approximately 400 pods. The pods were stacked in rows of 8, floor to ceiling, running the full length of each bay, a design choice that maximized density and minimized the total space required. Walking into a hibernation bay was walking into a room of sleeping people. The subtle visual noise of respiration monitors, the faint ambient glow of status indicators, the low hum of the systems that kept every pod at exactly the right temperature, pressure, and biochemical balance. Many of the pods were dark. Those were the ones that had failed, or been powered down when their occupants were lost. They were everywhere throughout the bays, dark gaps in the rows of lit indicators, markers of the long attrition of the journey. But 4,317 pods were lit. Dr. Claire O'Say, the ship's chief medical officer, a third-generation crew member in her late 30s, with the calm precision of someone who had been practicing this specific medicine since she was a teenager, explained the waking process to the Kaldren medical team lead with efficient patience. They come out in stages, she said. First we adjust the temperature, raise it by half a degree every 4 hours. The body starts to remember. The circulatory system activates. The brain begins to cycle back from its deep suppression state. When the brain shows minimal activity above threshold, we begin the fluid adjustment. The hibernation compounds are cleared slowly. Too fast causes cascade shock. We lose people that way. How long does the full process take? For a standard pod in good condition, 48 hours from initiation to the point where the patient is awake and coherent. 4 pods that have been cycling longer, the ones at the far end of the last rotation, who've been under the longest, up to 72 hours. How long have some of them been under? Dr. O'Say was quiet for a moment. The oldest continual hibernation on this ship is a woman who has been cycling on and off for approximately 12,000 years. She's been awake several times during the journey, brief periods usually for medical checks. But her accumulated awake time over 12,000 years is probably less than 8 years total. The Kaldren medical lead stared at her. She's 12,000 years old? Biologically she's 41. Said Dr. O'Say. Her name is Margaret Torres. She was part of the original departure crew. She went under in year 7 of the mission and has been cycling ever since. She paused. She's our last survivor from Earth. A long silence. She remembers it, Dr. O'Say said softly. She was born in a city called Nairobi. She was 31 when she boarded this ship. She remembers Earth the way it was. Every time she wakes up for a check, she asks the same first question. What does she ask? She asks if we're home yet. The waking went well for the most part. There were losses. 7 people whose pods had degraded beyond recovery in the last years of the journey, who had been alive on the monitors until the very end but who could not be brought back. Dr. O'Say recorded them in the ship's log with the same careful attention that every loss had been recorded for 20,000 years. The rest came through. They came out confused, as people who had been asleep for years or decades always came out confused. They came out asking questions, often the same questions in the same order. Where are we? How long? Is everyone okay? The ship's awake crew, the skeleton rotation, moved through the bays with practiced efficiency, answering, reassuring, helping people sit up, bringing water and the specific nutrient broth that Dr. O'Say had developed as the best recovery food for post-hibernation physiology. The alien medical teams watched from a careful distance, not wanting to overwhelm people who were already in a vulnerable state with the additional shock of alien presence. They would learn. The humans were more resilient than they looked, and the waking crew adapted to the presence of the alien teams faster than anyone expected. But the first hours were kept as calm and familiar as possible. By the third day, the lower bays were alive with the quiet, tentative bustle of 4,000 people beginning to understand what had happened. Not everyone handled it well. That would have been an impossible expectation. 4,000 people coming out of hibernation meant 4,000 individual responses to the news that their ship had made it, that the journey was over, that they were back in known space, and also that Earth was empty, that most of humanity was dead, that the galaxy had declared them extinct, that they had been gone for 20,000 years. Some people cried. Some people didn't speak at all for days. Some people asked to go back under, an option that Dr. Osei declined gently but firmly, because the medical risks of re-entering hibernation at this stage were too high. Some people immediately started asking practical questions. What happened next? What did they need to do? Where were they going? A few people, over the course of the first week, asked to look out the windows. There were 3 surviving observation ports, small, reinforced windows and corridors near the outer hull that had been maintained and polished throughout the journey. The ship's crew had always kept them clear, always kept them in good repair, because being able to see the actual stars, real stars through real glass, not on a screen, had mattered to people in ways that were difficult to explain. People lined up to look through those windows. They stood there for long minutes, sometimes longer, looking at the stars of known space. Closer now, more numerous, the familiar constellations that human culture had named and drawn and built stories around for 30,000 years. The stars their ancestors had looked up at from the surface of a planet they could no longer visit. Several people asked about Earth specifically, where it was, whether they could see it. Captain Shin had prepared for this. She had Zara plot Earth's position in the night sky visible from the windows, a faint point of yellow-white light, almost imperceptible without knowing where to look. She told people exactly where to look. They looked. Most of them cried. Margaret Torres woke up on day 4. She was the last to wake by Dr. Osei's design. She needed extra time, extra care, extra monitoring, because her pod was the oldest and her body's hibernation patterns were the most complex. She came out of it the way she apparently always came out, gradually, then all at once. One moment she was still, the next she was moving, her eyes opening with a directness that suggested her brain was already active and oriented before her body had finished waking up. She was physically small. Dark-skinned, slight, with close-cropped natural hair that had a little white at the temples. She looked 41 because biologically she was 41. But her eyes were different from a 41-year-old's eyes. They were calm in a way that only came from very long experience. Even if that experience was mostly experienced in sleep, 12,000 years left marks. She sat up. She looked at Dr. Osei. She asked her question. Are we home yet? Dr. Osei took her hand. Yes, Margaret. We're home. Margaret Torres closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them they were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was breathing very slowly and deliberately, the way someone breathes when they are making sure they don't break apart. Good, she said. Good. She sat for a while. Then she asked to see the captain. Maya Chin came to her, rather than the other way around. She pulled up a chair beside Margaret's pod and sat. The 2 women looked at each other, the woman who remembered Earth and the woman born on this ship who had never known anything but the journey. I heard the news, Margaret said. Earth is still there. It is. Can we go? Maya was quiet for a moment. Eventually, yes. I think we will. Margaret nodded slowly. I want to see the ocean, she said. I've dreamed about it. The ocean. The way it smells. She looked at her hands, small, slightly stiff from the long hibernation. I told myself for 12,000 years, in the moments when I was awake enough to know what was happening, I told myself that as long as we kept going, eventually someone would get to see the ocean again. She looked up. Is the ocean still there? Maya had checked. She had asked Sorithvel, who had checked the Galactic Compact's observation records of Earth. The ocean is still there, she said. All of it. Margaret Torres leaned back against her pod. She closed her eyes. She breathed. Okay, she said. Then it was worth it. The news traveled fast. Humanity, declared extinct 17 sessions ago by the formal vote of the Galactic Compact, memorialized in a monument still under construction, mourned with the distant, abstract grief reserved for things that are gone before you fully understood what you had, was not extinct. 4,317 humans were alive aboard a battered Ark-class carrier in the outer deep. They were coming home. And they had brought with them 20,000 years of data, experience and stubborn survival. The galaxy, predictably, had a lot of feelings about this. The first official response came from the Galactic Compact within 72 hours of the fleet's first detailed reports. It was a formal statement of welcome, authored by all 47 member species, or at least by the 46 species that had voted for humanity's extinction. Thessaly Vorn's name was on it too, but she had added a personal addendum that said, simply, "I told you." The statement was warm. It was also very carefully worded. The political staff of 47 different civilizations had clearly spent those 72 hours hammering out language that expressed genuine welcome while also carefully not addressing several very uncomfortable questions, like, whose fault was it that the cascade warnings hadn't been heeded, and what were the legal implications of having declared an actively living species extinct, and what was the current status of humanity's original territorial claims in what was now occupied space? These questions did not go unnoticed. Maya Chen, reading the compact statement in her small captain's office aboard the Perseverance, noted the careful language with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this and had already begun preparing. She had, in fact, already begun preparing. She had not spent the last 6 months of the journey only preparing for first contact. She had spent those months working with the ship's legal scholars. The Perseverance had maintained a legal tradition, drawing on the original UN emergency resolution that had authorized the Earth Continuity Mission, on the question of humanity's rights and status upon return. Her position was clear. Humanity was not extinct, had never been extinct, had maintained sovereign continuity through the Earth Continuity Mission, and retained all rights and claims that had been in place at the time of departure. The Compact's declaration of extinction was, by any reasonable interpretation of galactic law, incorrect and potentially damaging. She was, however, also practical enough to know that making this argument in a combative way would be counterproductive. They needed allies. They needed goodwill. They needed housing, resources, medical support, and a place to rebuild while they figured out the 1,000 questions of what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had gotten used to their absence. "We play nice," she told her senior staff in a briefing the day after the compact statement arrived. "We are grateful. We cooperate. We share our data. We contribute. And we very clearly, very formally, very firmly establish our legal status, not as refugees, not as survivors, but as a civilization with continuity, returning from an emergency displacement." "The compact may push back," said her legal advisor, a small, precise man named David Park who was, like Maya, third-generation crew. "The compact can push all it wants," said Maya. "We have the data. We have the history. We have 4,000 people and we have been keeping records for 20,000 years. Nobody in that chamber has better documentation of their own continuity than we do." David Park allowed himself a small smile. "We do have excellent records. We have perfect records," Maya said. "Because my great-grandmother's great-grandmother's great-great-grandmother started a tradition of never letting a single person go undocumented, and we kept it for 200 generations." She paused. "That's who we are. That's what we're going to show them." The public reaction from individual species was more varied and, in many cases, more honest than the official compact statement. The Vreth, characteristically, released a detailed academic analysis of the cascade event within a week of receiving the Perseverance's data. It was a thorough, rigorous piece of scientific work that concluded, with a particular Vreth genius for painful honesty wrapped in precise technical language, that humanity's cascade models had been substantially more accurate than Vreth analysis at the time had credited, and that the failure to seriously consider human warnings represented a significant analytical error with significant consequences. They did not use the word mistake. Vreth scientists almost never used the word mistake. But the implications were clear, and in Vreth academic culture, a paper of this level of detail on a failure of this scale was approximately equivalent to every single Vreth scientist involved in the original analysis standing up in public and saying, "We were wrong. They were right. We are very sorry." The response from Vreth civilians was enormous. Within days of the paper's publication, the Vreth public communication networks were flooded with an outpouring of, well, there was no Vreth word for guilt exactly, but the closest translation was the uncomfortable awareness that a correct action was not taken. There were public memorials. There were broadcasts. There were contributions, voluntary contributions from private citizens, to an emergency fund for the returning humans, before any government had organized anything formally. The Caldran reaction was different. Corvin Sill had become, somewhat unwillingly, famous. The explorer who had found the ghost ship, who had kept his post for 5 weeks waiting for the fleet, who had sent the message that changed everything. He gave one interview, reluctantly, and in it he said something that became widely repeated: "They kept sending the signal for 800 years not knowing if anyone would hear it." That is the most Caldren thing I have ever heard a non-Caldren species do. He meant it as a compliment of the highest order. The Morvathi said nothing publicly, which was typical, but their intelligence services quietly declassified a set of historical records that turned out to include the original human cascade warning transmissions, received and archived by Morvathi stations 20,000 years ago and never acted upon. The declassification came with no statement, no explanation, and no apology. But the records were there, and anyone who wanted to could read them, and read exactly what humanity had tried to tell the galaxy. The Thessaly published 43 papers in 3 weeks. The response that affected the crew of the Perseverance most directly, however, was not from any government or scientific body or intelligence service. It came from the general public of the galaxy, in the form of a signal flood. When the news went public, the Galactic Compact's standard communication relay, the network that connected all known civilizations in real time across the vast distances of known space, received more traffic in a single week than it normally received in a year. The majority of it was addressed to the Perseverance. Messages. Personal messages. From individual beings across 47 civilizations, in hundreds of languages, of every length and content imaginable. Some were formal. Some were informal. Some were brief, a single word or a single image. Some were extraordinarily long, multi-page transmissions from historians, scientists, ordinary citizens who had grown up reading about humans in history archives and found themselves needing to say something to the reality of their existence. Many of them said variations of the same thing. Welcome back. Many of them said, we thought you were gone. Some of them said, we're sorry we didn't listen. A few, from species old enough to have memories of humans in the galaxy, said things more specific. I remember your music. I remember the day I met a human. I remember what it was like before you disappeared. Maya Chin had not anticipated this. She had prepared for official responses, for political negotiations, for practical challenges. She had not prepared for the simple human reality of receiving millions of personal messages from strangers who had things to say. She brought Zara to her office when the first batch of processed messages came through and showed her the count. That's, Zara started, looking at the number. Then she stopped. Yeah, said Maya. Zara stopped again. They know us. They know our history. They know what the archive says about us. But now, Maya gestured at the screen. Now they're talking to us. Zara was quiet for a moment. Do we respond? We respond to every single one, said Maya. We don't have enough people to respond quickly, so it'll take time. But every message gets a response. She paused. Because that's who we are. Zara looked at the count again. Millions of messages. That's going to take a while, she said. Then we'd better start. The journey from outer deep Sector 9 to the nearest inhabited system of known space took 4 months at the Perseverance's current speed. Those 4 months were not quiet. They were, in fact, some of the most intensely social 4 months that the crew of the Perseverance had experienced in living memory, which was saying something, given that the awake crew had lived in the close company of 100 or so colleagues for their entire lives. Now they had the fleet. 4 allied ships traveling with them, their crews becoming gradually more comfortable with each other, their communication channels open nearly constantly. Meals were shared across ships via video connection. The Caldren and the humans discovered an unexpected mutual interest in the ritual of preparing and consuming food in company. The Vreth scientific teams and the Perseverance's engineers began a collaboration on the ship's drive systems that was, by all accounts, both productive and extremely argumentative, because the Vreth had strong opinions about proper engineering and the human engineers had strong opinions about what 20,000 years of practical problem-solving had taught them, and these two sets of strong opinions did not always align. The Thessaly interviewed everyone. They were very polite about it. They asked permission. They framed it as historical documentation. But they essentially worked their way through all 4,317 humans over the course of the 4 months, conducting conversations that were sometimes brief and practical and sometimes lasted for hours, depending on the person's willingness to talk and the Thessaly interviewer's ability to listen. The interviews were extraordinary. Not because of any individual story, though there were extraordinary individual stories, but because of the cumulative effect. 4,000 people, each carrying a different piece of the 20,000-year experience. Each with a different relationship to the journey, to the ship, to the long sleep, to the community that had sustained itself through everything. The Thessaly compiled the interviews into an archive that they named simply The Voice of the Perseverance. It was, when completed, the largest single collection of first-person human testimony ever assembled. It was immediately added to the Galactic Compact's permanent historical record. The Thessaly lead interviewer, a being named Vel Sorath, different from Sorath Vel who was continuing her direct work with the ship, said in a report to the Compact, "The most striking common element across all 4,000 testimonies is not the grief, though there is grief. It is not the resilience, though there is extraordinary resilience. It is the clarity of identity. These people, after 20,000 years and 200 generations, know exactly who they are. They have the most precise, most articulate, most consistent collective self-understanding of any people we have ever studied. They are human. They are utterly certain of it. And they carry that certainty not as a burden but as a gift." Thessaly Vorn spent most of the 4 months aboard the Perseverance. She had developed the habit as the fleet traveled of walking the ship's corridors in the late hours. The ship ran on a 24-hour cycle, maintained throughout the journey because human biology had never fully adjusted to anything else, when most of the crew was resting. She walked slowly, looking at the photographs, stopping sometimes to read the names in the memorial hall, sitting occasionally in the common areas while the late shift crew went about their work. She was not intrusive. She was simply present. The crew adapted to her presence with remarkable speed. Within 2 weeks, she was greeted by name in the corridors. Within 3 weeks, she had been invited to dinner 7 times. The human habit of expressing relationship through food was one of the oldest recorded human social patterns, and apparently 20,000 years had not diminished it. She attended 3 dinners. She couldn't eat human food, but she could sit at the table, and sitting at the table turned out to be what mattered. At one of these dinners, a woman named Rachel Kim, mid-50s, 3rd generation, had worked in the ship's agricultural systems her entire life, asked Thessaly Vorn a question that no one else had thought to ask. "What did it feel like?" Rachel said. "When we disappeared. What did it feel like to you?" The table went quiet. About 12 people were present. The dinner was a regular gathering of the agricultural team, and all of them looked at the ancient Uarshan. Thessaly Vorn was quiet for a moment. She had been asked many questions in the past 4 months. This was not the kind of question she had been asked before. "Like a song stopping in the middle," she said finally. "Not ending. Stopping. A note held and then gone before you know how the melody resolves. You are left with the shape of the absence." Rachel nodded slowly. "We didn't mean to leave," she said. "I know the reasons were real. But we didn't mean to leave everyone behind." "I know," said Thessaly Vorn. "Did other species—" Rachel paused. "Did they miss us?" "Yes," said Thessaly Vorn simply. "Some of them more than they knew until you came back. The galaxy has 47 civilizations and it is very orderly and very ancient and very good at many things. But it had become," she searched for the word, "predictable. The known species were known. The patterns were established. The history was understood. And then you were gone, and the last genuinely surprising thing had gone with you." She looked around the table. "You are the most surprising thing that has ever existed," she said. "In the best possible sense. You are the thing that happens when no one is expecting it. You make the universe larger simply by being in it." There was a silence that was warm, not heavy. Then Rachel Kim said, "We brought seeds." Thessaly Vorn blinked. "Seeds. Earth seeds. From the original biosphere. We maintained seed banks throughout the journey. They were one of the most carefully preserved things on the ship. We have seeds for thousands of species. If Earth's biosphere has been recovering for 20,000 years, maybe," she paused, "maybe some of these could grow there again." "It is possible," Thessaly Vorn said carefully. "The biosphere has changed significantly. The evolutionary pathways over 20,000 years are complex. But the basic conditions—" "We know it would be complicated," Rachel said. "We know it would take time. We're good at taking time." A small smile. "We've been practicing." Thessaly Vorn looked at the woman. This descendant of a species that had run from catastrophe, survived against every reasonable expectation, crossed 20,000 years of exile, and was now asking not about justice or territory or resources, but about seeds. Earth seeds. Because they wanted to put things back the way they found them. Or as close to it as they could get. The galaxy was not always this quiet. There was a time, a long, long time ago, when a small, loud, chaotic, emotional species filled the stars with noise. They called themselves humans. They came from a tiny blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in a spiral arm of the Milky Way that most elder races considered boring and forgettable. They were short-lived by galactic standards. They were soft-bodied, fragile, prone to disease, prone to war, prone to laughing at things that weren't funny, and prone to crying at things that didn't make logical sense. They were also, without question, the most interesting thing that had ever happened to the known galaxy. The Vreth remembered them. The Vreth were tall, silicon-based beings with 4 arms and 3 eyes, and their memory stretched back nearly 1,000,000 years. Their civilization had risen slowly, carefully, methodically. They had calculated every step. They had built empires through patience. They had achieved immortality through genetic engineering. They had reached the stars through mathematics so precise that even their art was composed of equations. And then they had met humans. Elder Counselor Zanvethsara sat at the head of the Grand Remembrance Chamber on Vreth Prime. The chamber was enormous, a dome of crystallized mineral that caught starlight and broke it into 1,000 colors across the floor. Around the long oval table sat representatives from every major galactic civilization still in existence. The Kaldrin, the Morvathi, the Tessaly, the Blonde Collective, the Uarshan, and the Pale Ones of the Outer Reaches. 47 species in total. All of them ancient. All of them wise by their own standards. All of them haunted by the same question. 20,000 years, Zahn said. His voice was low and resonant, the kind of voice that carried the weight of history. 20,000 years since the last confirmed human contact. 20,000 years since any signal, any ship, any biological trace, any data transmission. 20,000 years of silence. He let the number sit in the air. 20,000 years. To put that in perspective, the entire recorded history of human civilization from their first cave paintings to the moment they disappeared had been approximately 30,000 years. They had been gone for 2/3 of that span. If a human infant had been born on the day they vanished and lived a normal human lifespan of 80 years, that infant would have been dead for 19,920 years. The math was staggering. The silence was worse. The Remembrance Archive has been updated, said Counselor Mir of the Tessaly, a being who looked vaguely like a cluster of silver jellyfish that had learned to wear a robe. We are approaching the 20th millennial mark of the disappearance. In accordance with Article 7 of the Galactic Compact, we are required to formally vote on the reclassification of humanity. Reclassification, repeated Elder Zahn. You mean extinction. It is the correct term, said Blonde Speaker 9, one of 12 identical representatives from the Blonde Collective, a hive mind that communicated through synchronized vibration. Humanity has met every criterion. No confirmed survivors. No DNA traces in any explored system. No signal of any kind. No colony remnants. No automated messages. Nothing. By any reasonable scientific or legal standard, Homo sapiens is an extinct species. The chamber was quiet for a moment. They were not reasonable, said a voice from the far end of the table. Everyone turned. The speaker was old, ancient even by galactic standards. She was Uarshan, one of the oldest living species in known space, and she had personally witnessed the early years of human expansion. Her name was Thessaly Vorn, and she was 312,000 years old. Her body had long since been replaced by layers of biomechanical augmentation, but her eyes, 2 deep amber orbs set in a face of pale living stone, were still entirely organic. I said, she repeated, they were not reasonable. And that is precisely why I refuse to declare them extinct. Blonde Speaker 9 turned toward her with the collective's characteristic hum. Thessaly Vorn. With respect, you have voted against this reclassification in every single session for the past 12,000 years. Your argument has not changed. Because the facts have not changed, she said simply. They disappeared. That is all we know. We do not know why. We do not know how. We do not know where they went. A species that vanishes completely, without a body, without a wreck, without a grave, that is not extinction. That is a mystery. A 20,000-year mystery, said Zahn quietly. Yes, said Thessaly Vorn. And mysteries have answers. She paused. Her amber eyes swept the room slowly, touching each face with a gaze that had seen empires rise and collapse like sand castles. I remember when they were here, she said softly. I remember the chaos of it. The noise. The sheer, overwhelming aliveness of them. You couldn't stand near a human without feeling something. They radiated, I don't have a word for it in any language except theirs. Vitality. Pure, reckless, magnificent vitality. They burned so hot. Every single one of them. Even the quiet ones. Even the ones who sat alone in dark rooms. They all burned. The chamber was very still. I remember their music, she continued. I remember their wars, their poetry, their terrible jokes, their capacity for cruelty and their even greater capacity for kindness. I remember watching a human female once on a research station near what they called the Kepler Belt. She was a xenobiologist. Her name was Dr. Sarah Finch. She had spent 11 years studying a species of microorganism that no one else considered worth studying. 11 years. She cried when she made her breakthrough. Not because of the science, because she said the creatures were beautiful. She shook her head slowly. A species that finds beauty in microscopic organisms is not gone. It is waiting. The vote was called. 46 species voted for reclassification. 1 voted against. As always, the reclassification was formally approved. Humanity was declared extinct. A memorial was commissioned. It would be the largest structure ever built in the history of the galaxy, a monument to what had been lost. The Galactic Compact allocated resources. Architects were assigned. Plans were drawn. It would take approximately 200 years to complete. Nobody rushed. There was no one left to mourn. Far from Vreth Prime, in a region of space so distant that it hadn't even been mapped when humans disappeared, a young Kaldran explorer named Corvinsil was cataloging gravitational anomalies on the outer edge of what cartographers called the outer deep. The Kaldran were a medium-sized species, roughly the dimensions of a tall human actually, though they had 6 limbs, no nose, and a bioluminescent circulatory system that made their skin glow faintly blue in the dark. They were methodical, curious. She felt, in that moment, the full weight of what she had waited for. 300,000 years of living, 12,000 years of voting against a reclassification, 20,000 years of saying they are not gone, and here at the end of it was a woman asking about seeds with a quiet, patient, irresistible determination to grow something back. Yes, said Thessaly Vorn. I believe they would grow there. Rachel Kim smiled. Full and warm. Good, she said. Then we have work to do. They arrived at Thessaly Prime, the nearest inhabited system, the one closest to what had been human space, on a morning that no one on the Perseverance would ever forget. The ship came out of its long journey into the orbit of a system full of life. Full of ships. Full of stations and habitats and the visible, tangible evidence of civilizations that had continued while they slept. The crew stood at every window, crowded into the corridors near the observation ports, watching in silence as known space filled their sight for the first time. Real, present, immediate, not a reading on an instrument but actual light from actual stars in an actual inhabited system. Most of them had never seen this. The third-generation crew had been born to the journey. Most of the hibernating crew had last seen inhabited space 20,000 years ago through different eyes, younger eyes, the eyes of people who didn't know yet what was coming. Some of the oldest, the ones who had been cycling in and out of hibernation since the early centuries, had memories of it. But memory and reality are different things, and the reality of it, after so long, was overwhelming. They gathered at the windows and they looked and they were quiet. That was what hit the fleet, watching through external cameras, the silence. 4,000 people at windows and silence. Then someone in one of the lower corridors near the agricultural bays started to sing. It was not a song from the historical archive. It was a song that had been composed on the Perseverance itself, sometime in the last 1,000 years, one of the songs that had been written by crew members who had never known Earth, who had expressed their relationship to the idea of home in the only way available to people who have never seen it. It was simple. It was in English. It had a melody that was exactly the kind of melody that gets into your chest and stays there. Others joined in. First a few voices, then more, then the sound of it spreading through the corridors, picked up by people who knew the words because they had grown up with them, taught to them in the way that songs are taught, not in a classroom but by living among people who sing. The fleet, with its audio systems picking up the internal sound through the communication channels that had been kept open for months now, heard it too. It was not a triumphant song. It was not a victory anthem. It was quieter than that. More honest. A song about a place you have never been but have always known. A song about going somewhere that is and isn't home. A song about the 48,000 names on the walls, and the 4,000 who made it, and what it means to arrive somewhere that cost everything to reach. Corvinsil in his survey vessel, still traveling with the fleet, his original mission long forgotten, listened to the song and found, to his considerable personal embarrassment, that his bioluminescent circulatory system had begun to glow in a pattern that, in Kaldran biology, was associated with the activation of the deep emotional response centers. He was crying. Or the Kaldran equivalent of it. He did not try to stop. The formal arrival ceremony at Thessaly Prime Station was organized by the Galactic Compact with thoroughness and genuine warmth. The station, a large ring-shaped structure orbiting Thessaly Prime's second planet, had been prepared over the 4 months of the fleet's journey back. Quarters had been arranged for 4,000 people, which was a logistical challenge but not an impossible one. Medical facilities had been established. Communication access had been set up. A legal and administrative team had been assembled to help the returning humans navigate the process of re-establishing their formal status in the galactic community. And in the large central bay of the station, 47 species had sent representatives. Not just official representatives, though those were there too with their formal garments and their careful diplomatic expressions, but also ordinary citizens, researchers, historians, people who had read the archive records and felt something, people who had sent messages in the signal flood and wanted to be present for this. The bay was full when the crew of the Perseverance came through. They came in groups, not all at once. 4,000 people can't move through a station airlock in a single procession. They came steadily over the course of several hours. Each group moved into the bay and stopped, looking at the space, looking at the assembled beings of 47 species looking back at them. There were a lot of moments in those hours that were individually overwhelming. A young Vreth researcher, barely old enough to be posted to the station, who burst into spontaneous tears the moment the first group of humans walked through the door and was deeply embarrassed about it. A Morvathi dignitary who had remained completely silent throughout the entire ceremony until one of the last groups of humans came through and happened to include a very old man who looked, apparently, strikingly similar to a human the Morvathi had known 20,000 years ago, and the Morvathi said quietly to no one in particular, "I had a friend once who looked like that." A group of Kaldran children who had been brought by a school on a field trip and who were trying very hard to be quiet and dignified and failing magnificently, pressing forward to see better, asking their teachers questions in loud whispers. But the moment that everyone who was present remembered afterward, the moment that went into the record as the definitive image of the day, was when Margaret Torres came through. She was last. Not by accident. Dr. Osei had quietly suggested it, and Maya had agreed, and the rest of the crew understood without needing to be told. She walked through the airlock door on her own 2 feet. She was small and slight, and there were 12,000 years in her eyes, and she looked around the bay with an expression that no one who saw it could quite describe afterward, because it was too many things simultaneously, too much history compressed into a single human face. She walked to the center of the bay. She stopped. She looked up at the great transparent ceiling, through which the stars of known space were visible. The stars she had been born under, on a planet she had left when she was 31, under a sky she had not seen for 12,000 years. And then she knelt down. Not in submission. Not in prayer exactly, though it looked like something in that vicinity. She knelt down and she placed her hands flat on the floor of the station. A real floor, solid and warm, belonging to a place that was not a ship, a place that was connected to the broader inhabited universe, and she pressed her palms against it and she bowed her head. The bay went completely silent. Not a single being moved or spoke. After a long moment, Margaret Torres lifted her head. She looked around at the assembled representatives of 47 species. Her eyes were clear. "We're home," she said. Her voice was not loud. But the bay was so silent that it carried to every corner. No one said anything for a long time. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd of assembled beings, a Vreth counselor began the traditional Vreth gesture of formal acknowledgement, both pairs of hands raised, palms out. Around him, other Vreth did the same. And then the Kaldran made their gesture, which involved a brief bowing of the head. And the Tesserae and the Morvathi and the Blonde Collective and the Uarshan, and all the others, each in their own way, each with their own gesture, each with their own ancient vocabulary of recognition. And from the humans someone started to sing again. 3 months after the arrival at Thessaly Prime, a formal session of the Galactic Compact was convened, the first attended by a human representative in 20,000 years. Maya Chen attended as the designated representative of the Earth Continuity Mission, which was, upon extensive legal review, confirmed as a legitimate and continuously operating governmental entity with unbroken chain of authority dating to the original UN emergency resolution. The Compact's legal scholars had debated this for 8 weeks. The conclusion was, in the end, straightforward. A government does not need territory to continue existing. A government needs people, a mandate and continuity of authority. The Perseverance's records demonstrated all three, documented in detail going back to hour 1 of the mission. Humanity was not a new applicant to the Compact. Humanity was a returning member. This distinction mattered enormously for reasons both symbolic and practical. A new applicant would have needed to prove itself, to negotiate terms, to establish rights from scratch. A returning member had rights already established, rights that had been incorrectly suspended on the basis of a wrongful declaration of extinction. The Compact voted to formally rescind the Extinction Declaration, 47-0. Thessaly Vorn, casting her vote, said simply, obviously. The memorial that had been under construction, the monument to humanity's extinction, was repurposed. Maya-chan was asked, in consultation with the crew, what they wanted to do with the already built sections. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she came back with an answer. Keep it, she said. Finish it. But change what it's for. Change it to what? A memorial to the 48,000, she said. And to the Cascade event. And to the importance of listening to people who tell you something is coming. She paused. A reminder. The compact agreed. The monument was redesigned. Every name from the Perseverance's memorial walls was added to the central structure. All 48,000 inscribed in human text and in every galactic script used by the 47 compact species, so that no being in known space could look at that monument without seeing those names in a language they could read. Below the names, at the base of the structure, in human English and in standard galactic and in 20 other languages, a single sentence. They tried to tell us. We're listening now. The Cascade project began 6 months after the Perseverance's arrival. It was, by unanimous agreement of the Compact, the largest collaborative scientific endeavor in galactic history. Every member species committed resources. Every member species contributed expertise. The Perseverance's 20,000 years of observational data from the still pocket was the foundation, the most detailed dataset on the Cascade event's behavior and timing ever assembled. Dr. Amara Osei Williams, Claire Osei's younger sister, 26 years old, who had come out of hibernation with 3 science degrees she'd completed via the ship's educational program before going under at 18, was appointed as the human lead on the joint research team. She was the youngest person ever to hold such a position in any compact scientific body. She showed up to the first meeting of the research team with a notebook. A real, physical notebook. Made of paper because the Perseverance had maintained paper-making capability throughout the journey because someone, generations back, had decided it was important. The Vreth scientists found this enormously charming and deeply inefficient. She was unfazed. My great-great-great-grandmother started a tradition, she told them. You write things down. On paper. In your own handwriting. Because it makes you think more carefully about what you're writing. She opened the notebook. Now, let's talk about the Cascade. The research team eventually numbered over 8,000 scientists from 23 species. They were, by most accounts, the most argumentative, productive, creative, and occasionally baffling group of researchers ever assembled in the galaxy. They argued about methodology. They argued about notation. They argued about what to have for lunch because the humans wanted to eat actual food at regular intervals and several of the other species found this baffling. They were also, within 2 years, making progress that none of them had expected so soon. Because the humans had something that the other species had never had, 20,000 years of empirical data on a phenomenon that had previously only existed in theory. They didn't have to build the model from scratch. They had a model. A very good model, refined over generations by scientists who had dedicated their lives to understanding the thing that had exiled their species. It's not just a threat, Amara said in a briefing to the Compact leadership at the end of the first year. The Cascade is a threat, yes, and preventing the kind of damage it caused last time is the priority. But the physics, the underlying mechanism, it's extraordinary. It's not a simple wave. It's a manifestation of a deep galactic process. And if we can understand it fully, not just predict it and survive it but actually understand it, we might be looking at one of the most significant physics discoveries in the history of the Compact. What kind of discovery? Asked Elder Zahn. The kind that changes what we know about how the galaxy works, said Amara. The kind that opens doors. She paused. We've been thinking about it wrong. Every civilization has been thinking about it as a disaster. Something to be avoided. But it's not a disaster any more than a star going nova is a disaster. It's a process. A massive, complex, galactic-scale process that we don't understand yet. And your ship sat outside of it for 18,000 years, said Karithson. Yes. And we watched. And we learned. Amara looked around the room. We're very good at learning from things that are trying to kill us. It's kind of our specialty. The question of Earth was resolved slowly, carefully, and with great sensitivity. It was agreed after 18 months of legal, scientific, and practical discussion that humanity would return to Earth, not immediately, not in a single dramatic recolonization, but gradually and respectfully. The planet's biosphere had evolved significantly over 20,000 years. New ecosystems had developed. Descendant species of Earth's original fauna, evolved offshoots of the animals that had shared the planet with humans, now occupied ecological niches that hadn't existed before. These new species had rights. The ecosystem had value. It could not simply be reoccupied. But it was Earth. And humans had a right to be there, to be part of it, to rebuild a relationship with their home world that had been severed for 20,000 years. The plan that emerged was a model of the kind of patient, collaborative thinking that had characterized the Perseverance project from the start. A small team, volunteers beginning with Rachel Kim and her agricultural specialists, would go first. They would go as observers, as restorers, as careful and humble participants in an ecosystem that had moved on without them. They would bring the seeds. They would plant some of them, species proven compatible with the evolved biosphere, tested carefully before introduction. They would study. They would listen. And over time, years, decades, centuries if necessary, more people would follow. Rachel Kim was the first human to set foot on Earth in 20,000 years. She went alone with a small research team and support gear, landing in a meadow that, according to compact observational records, had once been the outskirts of a city in a region of East Africa. The city was gone. Not ruins, even, gone so completely that 20,000 years of ecology had reclaimed every trace. The meadow was alive with plants and small animals and the specific rich smell of equatorial African soil that Rachel Kim had never smelled in her life but had been described to her, in detail, by the only person on the Perseverance who had ever actually smelled it. She stood in the meadow for a long time. Then she opened the first seed case, one of thousands stored with extraordinary care throughout the journey, and she knelt down and she pressed the first seed into the earth. The communication channel was open. The fleet was watching. The compact was watching. Millions of beings across 47 civilizations were watching. Caro, she said softly, the word that had become a kind of touchstone aboard the Perseverance over the centuries, a word from Swahili that the ship's community had adopted as something between an affirmation, a greeting, and an expression of resolve. Now, here. This. HFY Garana High. From this moment I am coming home. She pressed the seed into the earth. She covered it with soil. She stood up. She looked at the meadow, at the sky, at the blue-white sun that her great-great-great-grandmother had been born under, that she had never seen except through the observation window of a ship. It was warm. She hadn't expected it to be warm. Not like this. Not like a real thing pressing against her suit, against the skin of her hands, against her face. Warm. She began to cry. Not dramatically, not collapsing, not losing herself. Just quietly, honestly, with the specific simple grace of a person who has reached the place they have always been going and found that it is real. It's real, she said into the open channel. It's real. It's here. Behind her, on the Perseverance, 4,000 people heard her voice and were quiet. In the memorial hall, 48,000 names were inscribed on the walls. The walls had been photographed and the photographs had been transmitted to the Galactic Compact and added to the permanent record. Every name. Every life. Documented, preserved, remembered. Not lost. Not forgotten. Carried here to this meadow, to this soil, to this warmth. Here the name said, "We are here. We brought you home." 2 years after the arrival at Thessaly Prime, Corvin Sill filed his survey report. It was, by his own admission, the most delayed survey report in Caldren exploration history. He had been somewhat distracted. He submitted it with a personal note attached to the section on the anomalous deep space contact, which read, "I initially classified this as an anomalous object on approach vector from deep space. I now believe the correct classification is, a people coming home. I have adjusted my records accordingly." He was given an award by the Caldren High Council, which he found somewhat embarrassing. He was also given a very long formal designation that was the Caldren equivalent of, the person who found the thing, which he liked better. He visited the Perseverance once more, before it was formally retired into a preservation dock to serve as a permanent museum and monument. He walked through the corridors one last time looking at the photographs. He stood in the memorial hall and read names for a while, not all of them because that would have taken years, but some of them. Enough. He stood in the doorway of one of the Woken hibernation bays, which was empty now, its pods open and dark, its occupants out in the galaxy making whatever came next. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked back to the airlock, stepped through and went back to his survey vessel. He had other sectors to catalog. But for a long time afterward, when he was alone in the dark of deep space with his rust-flavored coffee, he thought about that thermal signature. That tiny, impossible, determined flicker of heat in the heart of a ship that had no business still being in one piece. Biology, he had thought. Living things produce exactly that kind of heat. He had been right. He had been right about all of it. Margaret Torres lived for another 11 years after the arrival at Thessaly Prime. Biologically, she was still in her early 50s. The hibernation had been strange and thorough in its preservation. She spent most of those years on Earth. She got to see the ocean. She went with a small group, Rachel Kim, Dr. Osei, Zara Williams and 2 others, on a carefully planned excursion to the eastern coast of what had once been called Africa, where the Indian Ocean met land that was now covered in new forest and new life. They traveled in a small vehicle designed to minimize contact with the fragile, evolving ecosystem. They stopped at the edge of the forest and looked out. The ocean was vast and blue and moving and real. Margaret Torres walked to the water's edge. She took off her environmental monitoring glove, just for a moment, just enough, and she touched the water with her bare hand. It was cold. She had always imagined it would be warm. She was not sure why. The warmth was in the air, in the sun, in the rich smell of salt and biology, but the water itself was cold, the specific living cold of deep ocean water, and it shocked her hand and made her gasp. She laughed. It was a short, surprised, genuine laugh. The laugh of someone who discovers that the reality of something is better than the imagined version, not because it matches the imagination but because it doesn't, because it is more than that, because it is real. "It's cold," she said. "Is that okay?" asked Zara, who was watching her with something careful and tender in her expression. "It's perfect," said Margaret. "It's perfect. It's exactly right." She stood at the water's edge for a long time. The waves came in and touched her feet through the protective covering of her suit, the motion of them, the rhythm of them. The same rhythm that had been moving since before the first human had ever looked at a sea. The same rhythm that had kept going while humanity ran and survived and came back. She looked at the water. The water looked back at her with 1,000,000,000 years of patience. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for waiting." Elder Zanveth Sara issued a personal statement on the 1-year anniversary of the Perseverance's contact, which was unusual. The Vreth were not given to personal statements, preferring official communications through proper channels. But this statement was personal. It was brief. It was, by the standards of any species, honest. "We failed them once," he wrote. "We heard their warning and we chose not to believe it. We watched them disappear, or believed we watched them disappear, and we grieved, eventually, in our own way. We built a memorial to what we thought was their extinction. We declared them gone. They were not gone. They were in the dark, keeping each other alive, keeping their records, keeping their names, keeping their seeds, keeping their promises. For 20,000 years, in the quiet that we imposed on them through our failure to listen, they persisted. I do not know if the word sorry translates to anything adequate across the distance of 20,000 years and 48,000 deaths. I suspect it does not. But I say it anyway because they deserve to hear it and because saying it, meaning it fully and completely, is how you begin to be different. We will be different. We will be the civilization that listens now. They have come back and they have brought a warning and a gift and the data for 10,000 years of work. We will do the work. And we will listen." Thessaly Vorn, 312,000 years old, oldest living being in the Galactic Compact, wrote nothing official. But Zara Williams, who had become, over the months of the journey in the first years at Thessaly Prime, something like a friend to the ancient Uarshan, showed her the memorial monument once in a projected rendering before the final construction was complete. Thessaly Vorn looked at it for a long time. At the 48,000 names. At the sentence at the base. At the size of it, enormous, visible from orbit, built to last as long as the materials would hold. "Is it right?" Zara asked. "The monument. Does it feel right to you?" "Nothing about loss feels entirely right," Thessaly Vorn said. "But this is," she paused, searching for the word. "Honest. It is honest. It does not pretend to be a comfort. It is a truth made into stone." Zara nodded. She looked at the rendering for a while. "My mom told me before I was born, she was still carrying me and she was on a wake rotation and she used to talk to me while she was navigating. She told me that her grandmother told her and her grandmother told her, going back all the way to the beginning, that the point of the whole mission was not just to survive. It was to come back with something. Not just ourselves. Something to contribute." She gestured at the rendering of the monument. "At the Cascade Research Project. At the seed banks now growing on Earth. At the 4,000 people scattered across Thessaly Prime and the nascent communities growing elsewhere, making connections, building relationships, doing the 10,000 years of work." "UBSYMJHY," she said quietly. "That's what we say. From now. From this moment. This is where we begin." Thessaly Vorn looked at the young navigator, this young woman who had been born on a ship in the dark, who had grown up with stars outside her window and names on the walls, who had held the course for 20,000 years of inherited promise. "You know," she said, "I have been alive for 312,000 years. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have seen stars born and I have seen them die. I have watched every form of intelligence this galaxy has produced make its particular shape in the history of things. She paused. You are still the most interesting thing that has ever happened. Zara Williams smiled. The full, warm, quick smile that changed her face completely. Caro, she said. No. Here. This. Caro, Thessaly Vorn agreed. Epilogue, 10,000 years later. The Cascade early warning system activated on a Tuesday. It had been operating for 9,847 years. It had been built by every civilization in the Galactic Compact, improved by every generation of the Joint Research Project, refined and expanded and made more precise over nearly 10 millennia of collaborative effort. It monitored the deep galactic mechanisms that generated the cascade. It measured, it modeled, it predicted. And on a Tuesday in the 47th year of the mission of the research vessel Perseverance 2, named deliberately, pointedly, gratefully, its primary alert triggered. The cascade was coming. Not for another 200 years. That was the refined projection. 214 years until the front would reach the outer spiral arm. 214 years. Plenty of time. The captain of the Perseverance 2 was a woman named Dr. Adise Chintores, the name carrying both its histories deliberately as all names on this ship carried their histories. She was the fifth-generation descendant of Maya Chin and the fourth-generation descendant of Margaret Torres, which had required a certain amount of deliberate genealogical effort by the families involved but had seemed important to everyone concerned. She read the alert. She transmitted it immediately to every compact member, to every inhabited system, to every listening post and relay station and research platform in known space. The cascade is coming. We have 214 years. We are ready. We will not run. Not this time. We are ready. She attached the coordinates of the early warning system's detection point, the projected timeline, the recommended response protocols, all of it developed over 9,847 years, all of it ready, all of it waiting for this exact moment. Then she opened a secondary channel. To Earth. To the meadow where Rachel Kim had pressed the first seed into the soil 200 years ago, which was now a thriving mixed forest of ancient Earth species and new Earth species, growing together in the complicated, imperfect, beautiful way that things grow when you give them time and attention and don't ask them to be perfect. We have the warning, she said. We have time. We have the plan. She paused. Caro. HFY, from now I am going forward. She closed the channel. She looked at the stars ahead. She set the course. The Perseverance 2 moved forward, through known space, through the inhabited galaxy, through the 10,000 years of preparation, through the 20,000 years of exile and return and remembering, through all of it, into what came next. Into the future that 48,000 names had died to make possible. Into the home that 4,000 survivors had crossed the dark to reach. Into the galaxy that had once declared them gone, and had learned, slowly, imperfectly, finally, to listen. The stars were ahead. The humans were going. As they always had. As they always would. The end.